Looking for NFL football? Stop right here. You found your home for weekly NFL talk and fantasy football. Coming to you live from the BackupPunter.com. This is the Backup Punter Podcast. Now, here's your host, the man who thinks fullbacks win championships, Keegan Matheson.
Welcome back. It's episode 24 of the Backup Punter Podcast, and finally, after 23 episodes, we get to have an episode of the podcast after real regular season NFL football. Now, it was a great week one. We had 2 good days of football with Thursday night's game between the Patriots and Steelers. That was a good one. Sunday was a great game. Lots of good fantasy football to unpack from that day, which we'll get into later in the show. But then Monday came. Falcons versus Eagles. The early game, I thought it was fantastic. Watching Chip Kelly's team will never get old to me. And watching Matt Ryan and the kicker Matt Bryant will never get old to me. More on that in a second. But that Minnesota Vikings and San Francisco 49ers game. Number one, what the hell were the 49ers wearing? Those jerseys have to be the worst idea I've ever seen. But that might have been one of the poorer played football games I've seen in a few years. And to be honest with you, I had to turn it off in the third quarter. Not because I was tired, not because I had something else to do, but it just wasn't entertaining. And between the poor football and Trent Dilfer screaming at me, I don't know why he's employed to call football games, but it just wasn't good. And after an entire winter, spring, summer, waiting for real NFL football, to turn off a game in week one, it didn't feel good. But regardless, we got 15 other great games earlier in the week, so we'll try to unpack that this week. And we'll also get into some fantasy football sleepers, streamers for week 2 to help you out with your fantasy team. Now, I had a good week to start off the season. I managed to go 3-0, but not without a lot of luck. I'll tell you some of it now and a little bit when we get into our fantasy stud team, along with the dud team a bit later. But going into last night, it looked like I'd go 2-1 for the week. And that's why I decided to join a third league this year, because I'm a very serious fantasy player. I like to get into the league. But I figured, you know what, I will join this third league, because then I can focus on going 2-1 every week. If I go 2-1 each week, more weeks than I go 1-2, then I've got a good chance at making the playoffs twice. And that's good enough for me. And what I had last night in one of my leagues, probably the longest running league I have, the most serious one, I had Matt Bryant, and my opponent had the Vikings receiver, Charles Johnson. And I was behind by a pretty significant amount. It was one of these things where I was watching the game almost as a joke, just to see, hey, what can Matt Bryant do? Well, Matt Bryant put up 17 points, and I got lucky. I got completely lucky, and I take no credit for that one. But those are the types of wins that you kind of need to hair grease your way through a fantasy football season. And don't lose sight of the fact of the thing that I told you in a couple podcasts ago, my fantasy football rules for the night before your draft, that fantasy football is mostly about luck. We say that we play fantasy football. No, we don't. We set a roster, and we see how it goes. There is a ton of luck involved, and that's why it drives me nuts when someone brags about their fantasy team. I mean, you didn't do anything out of the ordinary that no one else would do. I didn't make a genius selection in Matt Bryant. I think I just went to the page, picked a guy from the top 5 whose team I thought would score some points, and I got really lucky. Nothing more and nothing less. So you can find me on Twitter at the Backup Punter. Check out thebackupppunter.com, which at long last has articles. I've returned some content to the website now that the off season's over. So you will find my weekly NFL Studs and Duds team. I'll usually get that up on Monday, maybe early Tuesday. And then I'm going to save my fantasy sleepers for the podcast. So you can, if you're listening already, if you're subscribed, thank you. There's been some great reviews on iTunes. Some really encouraging feedback, and I really appreciate that. Some people also choose to listen on YouTube, so you can subscribe to the Backup Punter Podcast channel on YouTube if that's a little easier for you on the go. But we're also on iTunes and on Stitcher. And check out some other podcasts as well from the Dynasty Sports Empire Podcast Network. I'll link to that after the show. This show is brought to you by those fine folks. And also check out DSE_football on Twitter if you're still looking to get involved in some fantasy football, looking towards next year. But at the same time, it's almost time for fantasy basketball, fantasy hockey. Now, I'm more of a fantasy hockey guy myself, I'll admit. I'm still a newborn when it comes to basketball knowledge. But check out Dynasty Sports Empire for some fantasy hockey, anything else you need this winter, fantasy-wise. Now, let's get into it. Let's get into week 1, and we won't address my game picks, which were pretty mediocre, and I can promise they'll be pretty mediocre throughout the entire season, but hopefully we'll have fun with those. Check out my game picks every Thursday afternoon before you have to submit yours. What I'm going to do today, we'll go through the studs, we'll go through the duds, and we'll save the sleepers for the end. So you can jump ahead to the end if you're just here for the sleepers and you want to get the hell out. And I understand that. That's totally fine. So it was a good week for a lot of people who made some value picks towards the end of their draft. A couple of them were players that I have been kind of beating the drum for. One of those is quarterback 1 on the fantasy studs team. And to be a QB1 or a wide receiver 1 on the stud team, it doesn't necessarily mean you scored the most points, period. If you are a guy who was supposed to be the 20th ranked quarterback and you came up and you were the 3rd or 4th ranked, well, that's more important to me than being the number 1 ranked quarterback as Aaron Rodgers, because you know you're going to get that from Rodgers, from Luck, from Drew Brees, from guys like this. But when you get value, like people got from Carson Palmer in week 1, that's what sets you apart as a fantasy stud. Now, Carson Palmer, right along with Sam Bradford, he was someone I was advising people to target late in their draft. I didn't get Palmer on any of my teams. I went Bradford, but they were both good options for if you missed out on the quarterback run, which was a theme this year, quarterback runs. And getting caught in the middle of one of those was never good. It was not a good place to be. So for people who were able to avoid them entirely and grab Carson Palmer, they had a great first week. 307 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. The offense actually looks okay. Now, Andre Ellington looks like he'll be out for a bit. I don't know if that's a massive hit to them. I don't like Chris Johnson one bit, but they have David Johnson there as well, and I think they'll be okay. Carson Palmer also added 14 yards on the ground, which you can't expect every week, but I love those little extras from quarterbacks. That extra 1.4 points goes a long way. Running back 1 on the stud team. Now, keep in mind this was done on Monday, before Carlos Hyde absolutely went off against the Minnesota Vikings, which surprised me. I was not high on Carlos Hyde. I'm still not over the moon about him, but it certainly improved what I do think about the 49ers running back, especially against a good Vikings D. Another strange note from that game, Adrian Peterson was used very oddly. I almost got suspicious that he wasn't physically right, that something was off, because a lot of times he was just standing on the sideline, looking sour. Now, I understand they want Matt Asiata in there in the hurry-up offense on passing downs to protect Teddy Bridgewater to come out of the backfield. But I don't see why they didn't feed Adrian Peterson 25 touches. I mean, make that guy run the football until he gets sick. You have to. That's their best strategy. So I think they'll come out much different in week 2. But without Carlos Hyde qualifying, because I cut it off a little bit early, Matt Forte takes home your RB1 on the stud team. And this one pains me as a Packers fan. He cut the Packers up. Now, if you're looking for a weekly streamer of some sort at running back, looking for the Packers as an opponent, that's not a bad strategy. They were awful on run defense. Their run defense is complete ass at the moment. They cannot stop them at the line of scrimmage. They were not setting an edge at all. And Matt Forte also had some success receiving out of the backfield, 25 yards through the air. He did add a rushing touchdown as well. It was a bad day. Even Jay Cutler ran for 31 yards. Jay Cutler, 31 yards. I was worried that Matt Forte would break down, that age would catch up to him quickly, that he'd kind of hit a wall this year, because he didn't look great on the ground last year. Maybe the Bears moving long inside to outside to tackle, maybe that helped the running game a bit. It would surprise me if that's what it was, but it looked really rejuvenated. Now, how much did the Packers play into that? Can Matt Forte keep it going next week? I don't know. But owners that did select Forte, they had to be worried. You had to be picking Forte. But this is a relief. This is a huge sigh of relief for Forte owners. And as you can see from nearly 30 touches, the usage is going to be there. No problem. Running back 2. This one makes me happy. Bishop Sankey. I pounded the drum for Bishop Sankey all offseason. And a lot of people did that along with me. And it's funny to watch a fantasy football offseason, especially looking at a guy like Sankey. Some people were high on him, and then, of course, fantasy football is just a massive groupthink. Everyone listens to the same shows, reads the same articles, and just groupthinks, swings back and forth with the masses. For no reason. Nothing changes. It's just like leading up to the NFL draft. People changing their positional rankings in February, in March. You haven't seen anything different. Nothing has changed. It's just for the sake of buzz, for conversation, for clicks. It's a waste of my time. Bishop Sankey, all along I thought he would at least be the likeliest candidate to be the lead back in Tennessee. It looked that way on Sunday. He rushed for 74 yards on the ground, added a rushing touchdown and a receiving touchdown. Terrence West didn't look good. Dexter McCluster, while I love him, he's not really a candidate to steal a lot of carries. Not much between the tackles, first down, anything like that. If Bishop Sankey can convince Ken Wisenhunt to get rid of this stupid idea of having a running back by committee, then he's a real play. I've got him already as an RB2 going into the next few games. Now, his floor is very low because if he loses this, if he gets out of this, if Marcus Mariota does not continue to play like he is Brett Favre mixed with Michael Vick, mixed with any great quarterback you can think of, maybe that puts a little more pressure on Sankey. But what a week from him. And he helped me win a couple of my games. On to the wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins from the Houston Texans comes in at number 1. Again, keep in mind, this should be Julio Jones. Honorable mention to him after the cutoff date. Julio Jones is really my favorite right now for wide receiver 1 overall this season. Julio Jones. Him and Antonio Brown, I think it's them and nobody else. DeAndre Hopkins, 98 yards with 2 touchdowns. Maybe Houston's quarterback situation is something that he can transcend. Maybe he's good enough, especially without Arian Foster for at least one more week. I'm excited about that return. But maybe DeAndre Hopkins can stay afloat and be truly elite this year. He's got all the talent. There's no one to take away coverage, which is my big worry. I think teams will find a way to snuff him out if they have an elite cornerback and some safety help, but this was a guy people would have been nervous about going into their week 1 after drafting him, and again, a big relief. Wide receiver 2, man, I just mentioned Antonio Brown. 133 receiving yards and a garbage touchdown at the end of the game, which counts just the same as a game-winning touchdown. All the same. So a big week from Antonio Brown. And I'd heard rumblings that some people were worried he'd regress this year. Now, those people didn't have any reason. I think they just wanted to provide a hot take, which is a lot of what's wrong with fantasy coverage. But I've got no problem with Antonio Brown being the wide receiver 1 overall, up there with Julio. His usage isn't going anywhere, especially with Martavis Bryant out for a few more weeks. He's going to get at least 10 targets a game in maybe every game this season. And wide receiver 3, my boy, the man I've clung on to too long. I kept him as a keeper once again in one of my deep keeper leagues, a 12-team league, Keenan Allen. And it's a same-round keeper league, so I was able to keeper him, I think, in the 9th or 10th round. And I was happy with it, but I wasn't expecting this. Caught 15 of 17 targets for 166 yards. Didn't get into the end zone, but if he continues to get that usage, he's going to end up there by accident. I am worried that, again, he's not producing these big plays. I don't want him to have to make 10 catches to get 100 yards. That's a point of worry. But he looks a little slimmer, a little faster, a little more explosive. Phillip Rivers obviously loves the guy, so I think it's going to be okay. Then we look at tight end 1 on the stud team, and this is another area, like I mentioned early in the show, where I got lucky. If you listen to this podcast, you heard last week the one area that I was nervous about. And I had said that I drafted 1 tight end on all 3 of my teams, which is a terrible strategy, one that I would not recommend to anyone, because if that tight end has a bad week, I'm looking at 0-3 instead of 3-0. And at the end of all my drafts, I missed out on the tight end run, And after the first 6 or 7 tight ends are off the board, number 8 is just the same as number 20 to me. It's such a big, cloudy group. So what I did is I waited till round 12, 14, 15 in my 3 drafts, and I picked up Tyler Eifert. My thinking was that Eifert would be the number 2 option and have some red zone targets. Well, he grabbed 2 touchdowns, went over 100 yards, and was the primary target for Andy Dalton. Now, that won't happen every week. A.J. Green will get his looks. There will be games where Jeremy Hill carries the ball 25 times and dominates. But Tyler Eifert established himself as a tight end 1, and without him, I'm 0-3. Again, this is where luck comes into this. I knew that Eifert would be good. I knew that people were not valuing him nearly high enough, but I would have been excited with 7 points. Maybe 5 catches for 70 yards, maybe if he had 2 catches for 20 yards and a dirty touchdown. I would have been over the moon with that because I wasn't expecting much from my tight end position. I didn't prioritize it, even though I wanted to. Value never lined up for me in my drafts. So to get this from Eifert, that's an example of me getting a few wins, not because I was smart, but because I made a mildly informed decision and got lucky. So he's a tight end 1. He should be probably unanimously owned in most fantasy leagues now. And a shout out to Austin Seferian-Jenkins too, who I suggested you take as a 15th round flyer. Even if you did that, I doubt many of you started him, which is understandable, but he put up a massive day, and he looks like he's Jameis Winston's security blanket, which is a good thing to be for tight end fantasy purposes. And then we look at the defense and special teams from the stud team. People, this is how I win leagues every year. And I don't mean win leagues as in, first overall, but this is how I win in my leagues. It's a terrible strategy, but I like to make my money streaming defenses and kickers. It's not going to be the best strategy, but it's a way that you can separate yourself and get an advantage. I think a bad strategy is picking a defense. If you get St. Louis or Seattle, roll with them. Awesome. But if you're getting a defense that's ranked 5th, 8th, 10th, 11th, don't just be satisfied with that every week. There's always going to be a better matchup. And I love to stream defenses. I do it each week. And when you do get these 20, 21 point weeks, that's going to give you a 10, 12 point advantage over your opponent from the word go. And just like I said that Matt Bryant off the top won me a week, the Carolina Panthers won me a couple weeks. A massive game against Jacksonville. Only allowed 9 points, 5 sacks, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, a touchdown. And if you're looking to stream a defense and you can find one that's playing the Jaguars, jump on it. You don't need to get fancy. You don't need to analyze anything. You don't need to read 1,000 articles. If you can find someone playing the Jags, jump all over it. And I have won more games with my defense than I have with RB1, wide receiver 1, quarterback 1. I'm willing to bet over the last few years. Again, I didn't mean to say that's how I win leagues off the top, because that doesn't happen. But it can win you a week when you don't deserve to win a week. And while it might not be the most fantasy football-esque, the most heroic way to win a week, I don't care. You can win with defense even in fantasy. So let's get over onto the dud team. There's a lot of talent on this dud team, and these are players who were expected to put up big weeks, were expected to compete for the top point total at their position, and they didn't do nothing. We're going to start out with Peyton Manning, who had an ugly one. And this is, to a certain extent, this is why I stayed away from Peyton Manning in any of my drafts. Even if I found good value, I didn't want it to be my problem. But again, I didn't think it would be this bad off the start. Peyton Manning passed for just 175 yards, threw an interception, no touchdowns versus the Ravens. Now, this was a great defensive game, especially from the Ravens side. They did lose Terrell Suggs, unfortunately. Now, Peyton Manning got the win. That's all that matters. But where are those numbers? If you got Peyton Manning in your fantasy draft, you probably did it pretty high. He's a guy that still went awfully high because he's a name. He's Peyton Manning. When you look at these numbers, they're going to bounce back, obviously, without a problem. But is he going to come back to those 350-yard games with 4 touchdowns? I don't think so. He's going to have those games of 2 275 with 3 touchdowns, but is that something you needed to spend a high pick on with really no keeper value past this season? I don't think so. And you have to worry about Demaryius Thomas in this situation, Emmanuel Sanders, and you have to worry about RB1 on the dud team, which is CJ Anderson. Anderson had a tough week in week 1. He rushed 12 times for just 29 yards. Peyton Manning wasn't able to find him at the right time in the passing game, and that's why I have a problem with people letting situation define a player. What I mean by that is, look at the Dallas Cowboys. People say, oh, it doesn't matter who the starting running back is. Look at that offensive line. They'll be a top 10 fantasy running back. It doesn't matter if it's Joseph Randle, Darren McFadden. That's not how simple it is. Just like people look at CJ Anderson and they say, oh, he's Peyton Manning's running back. Nothing else matters. He's going to get touches in the passing game. There's going to be running lanes for him because the defense will be focused on Peyton Manning. No matter who Peyton Manning's running back is, they will be great. Not necessarily. Ronnie Hillman, to be honest, looked a hell of a lot better than CJ Anderson. That's why I stashed Hillman on 2 of my teams on the bench, just because I don't think this is a bell cow situation. And if you're going to draft a guy in the first round, where you likely would have had to get CJ Anderson, I'm really not comfortable assuming that he's going to be the bell cow all season long. And I haven't been. I said that in my running back rankings before the season. Ronnie Hillman is talented in certain situations. And there are pieces of the game where he looked a lot better than Anderson. Looked more explosive, faster, quicker, more decisive. Keep an eye on this one. CJ Anderson did injure a toe. It looks like he's good to go on Thursday night. Anything can happen in these Thursday night games, which I don't think should really exist, because all they do is produce sloppy football. But sometimes for fantasy purposes, that's good. And we'll get back to that when we get into our sleepers a little later on. Continuing with the running back position on the dud team, just like Bishop Sankey made my day on the stud team, putting Frank Gore on the dud team, that one hurts. And he was misused. Going into this season, when I heard that the Colts wanted to scale back Frank Gore's workload, I cringed. That's not who he is. I understand that you want to keep him fresh for the playoffs, but if you try to scale back Frank Gore's workload into, well, what did he have on Sunday? 8 carries for 31 yards, if memory serves correct. If you keep him down at 12, 14 carries a game, you're not going to get Frank Gore. You're going to get a watered-down version of Frank Gore, and you're going to be disappointed. It's not going to be enough. Where Frank Gore has made his money his entire career is building up carries, getting stronger on his 15th carry, being stronger on his 18th carry than he was on his 17th, late in the game, pounding defenses. He's not going to get an opportunity to do that. And I really think that his fantasy value has to be put into question after this week 1 performance. Now, this was just a sloppy game all around. This was a bad matchup for Gore, a bad matchup for the Colts. So give this one a few weeks, but it's not a good sign. It hasn't encouraged me any more than I already was. Now we get into the wide receiver group, which is probably the most talented position on the dud team. Leading it off, we have Dez Bryant, and it's a little heartless to put him here with an injury, but he was a guy that people were depending on for 12, 15 points. And all they got was 48 yards on 5 receptions. It looks like he's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks, maybe more. People are worried that his foot injury is similar to that of Kevin Durant. And it really turned into a medical convention on Twitter the night after his injury. Initially, the report was, he's going to be closer to the 4 weeks than he will be to the 6 weeks. Then the reports came out, no, it's going to be a bit closer to the 6 weeks. Then the reports started to come out, well, it might be a 6 to 8 week thing. It might be like Kevin Durant's injury. All you can do, like any injury in fantasy, is prepare for the absolute worst. And if something better happens, then fantastic. But with Dez Bryant, at least this is something that should see him back by week 7, week 8, week 9, in that region. For the stretch run, for the playoffs, hopefully, if you can still get there. And as long as you can get into the dance, that's all that matters. So if you have to make some moves, make a trade to get some wide receiver production, now's definitely the time if you have Dez Bryant. Wide receiver 2, Odell Beckham, my beloved ego maniac, Odell Beckham. Anyways, he had a tough game against the Cowboys, and he really saw what his season is going to be like. I think the Cowboys' safeties targeted him. He was hit hard. Almost to the point of where I'm worried for the guy coming over the middle, and I hope that doesn't get in the back of his head. I hope he doesn't hear footsteps, because while I'm not wild about the guy off the field, his on-field talent is just about as much as anyone in football. At wide receiver, in terms of physical talent, I'd put him right next to Julio Jones. They might be unrivaled. It's absolutely amazing. Now, this was a disappointing one, week 1. He can't really live up to the hype no matter what he does. But it's a situation where you just need to wait. He's obviously the number one option. But Eli Manning didn't have a good game. The Giants, they didn't click. Something was off. And when that's back on, Odell will be fine. And then wide receiver 3, this one was a disappointing one. Calvin Johnson of the Lions. He caught what did he catch? 2 of 4 targets. I have the numbers in front of me here. 2 of 4 for 39 yards. And it's frustrating because he's finally healthy, apparently. For a few seasons now, it's been, is he falling apart? You'd only get 11 games out of him, 13 games out of him. Even when he's on the field, he's at 80%. So it's almost not worth it. Now that he's back healthy, you need touchdowns. You need big plays. I think they're going to come. Again, this just wasn't a great game for the Lions overall, with statistically speaking. Amir Abdullah took a lot of the offense on his shoulders, which is going to be interesting to watch. But Calvin Johnson, you can't have weeks like that from a guy who's probably your wide receiver 1. Then looking at tight end, maybe the most disappointing guy to land on this list is Greg Olsen. He's a guy that past Gronkowski, Graham, and Kelsey was probably tight end 4, and I have said he was the safest option outside of Gronkowski. Who else is Cam Newton going to throw to? Philly Brown? No. There's no one else on that offense. Devin Funchess? Not yet. I don't like Devin Funchess as an option this year at all, to be quite honest. He caught just 1 of 3 targets, Greg Olsen did, for 11 yards. And I think Rob Gronkowski is the only other player in the league who will face this, but Olsen is going to see primary coverage from opposing defenses. He will be the number 1 target to wipe out of the game. That's unique. You don't see that a lot as tight end. Especially in the red zone, he's going to have a safety over the top. He's going to be chipped off the line by a linebacker. He's going to have a cornerback trailing him. It's going to be tough mudding for Greg Olsen, but if you've drafted him, the only option is to stick with him. And then the defense, special teams that killed some people this week. Another surprise, the Houston Texans, despite J.J. Watt, despite Vince Wilfork, despite Jadeveon Clowney up front, couldn't get it done against the Chiefs. Allowed 27 points, just produced 2 sacks, no big plays. I think this is the Jamal Charles factor. It keeps teams on their heels. They don't want to blitz all out because it'll be Charles on a screen pass, a dump off. But they are owned, I think, unanimously in ESPN and Yahoo. At least 95% owned. They would have been about 90% started. That killed a lot of weeks. So that's it for the Stud and the Dud team. Again, I'll have the Stud and Dud team up on the backuppunter.com every Monday, maybe every Tuesday, if I wait a little bit and allow the Monday night game to get in for consideration. And what I think I'll do going forward is I'm going to save these sleepers and weekly streaming options for your waiver wire. I'll save those just for the podcast. So you can come into the podcast, and even if you just want to jump to the end and grab those streamers, that's fine. But we'll keep those for the podcast each week. And I'll try to give you a few options. And not just list options. We'll try to explain them, because it's important that you pick a guy you believe in. The worst thing to do in fantasy football is just read a stupid list and pick a guy because someone said so. Like I said in the podcast before most people did their drafts, I gave my fantasy football rules. And one of those rules was to make your own rankings and make your own mistakes. It's way more fun to win with a guy that you picked than to win with a guy that you saw number 1 on a list. So I'll try to give you a few players at each position. So sleepers and streamers heading into week 2 that I'd be looking at. If you're already looking for a quarterback at this point, that might be a bit worrying, but maybe these are guys you want to stash. I've got some questions about Tyrod Taylor. He had a good week. I think he came in just under 20 points. He looked fantastic. Now, my issue with Taylor is I don't think he's going to put up the counting stats. He could be extremely effective. He could have a perfect quarterback rating all season long, but he's not going to have those 300-yard games with 4 touchdowns. He's not going to be producing 30, 35-point weeks very often. I think it's going to be all about that running game still, all about the defense. And I think that Taylor will be a better real quarterback than a fantasy quarterback. But still, if you're looking to stash a guy on your bench in a deep league, or if you're in a 2 QB league, jump all over him. Another guy that is going to be probably close to unanimously owned after this week, Marcus Mariota, threw 4 touchdowns in the first half, barely needed to step on the field. I think he only threw a couple passes in the second half. Now, this is not how it's going to go every week. You don't need me to tell you that. The hype on Marcus Mariota is going to be through the roof this week. So it's one of those things where someone on waivers will probably grab him ahead of you, unless you're towards the bottom, but go for it. Because especially if he gets his legs a little more involved, go for it. He's a great option to have on the bench, and maybe someone offers you a trade for him later in the season, if you can afford to keep that guy there. And another guy at quarterback that maybe if you're looking to stash a guy as a potential candidate the next few weeks, Alex Smith. He's a guy I'd never recommend for fantasy purposes, to be honest, but this week he's got a Thursday night game coming up against the Denver Broncos. Whenever I look for a streaming option, I always look for, just like I look for the Jaguars as an opponent on defense, I love to look for Thursday night games because those breed sloppy, bad defense. And sometimes you'll have a lot of luck grabbing a guy playing Thursday night. Alex Smith also faces, I think, the Chicago Bears in week 3, and I think he faces the Green Bay Packers in week 3, and then the Bears in week 5. I've got Alex Smith's schedule mentally in my head, which I shouldn't ever do. I've reached a bad place in my life, people. But he has those matchups coming up, which should be positive matchups themselves. So if you are really desperate and you're just looking for a guy to get you 15 to 18 points and get out alive, think about it. Then at running back, I'll give you some guys here who are at least, no more than half owned in leagues. I hope to keep it under that for most of these sleepers and streamers. Danny Woodhead, 12 carries for 42 yards and 2 touchdowns. 4 catches for 20 yards. He looks like the red zone back in San Diego. If you are an owner of Melvin Gordon, you are cringing right now because Danny Woodhead is just the trusted back for Phillip Rivers in the red zone. There's going to be weeks where he only gives you 3 or 4 points, but if you can catch him on a touchdown week, you will be loving it. He's a guy to keep on your bench. I don't know if I'd run out and start him, but at this point in the year, through 1 week, you're already looking at a guy on your bench and saying, why the hell did I draft that guy? Why'd I pick him? So swap him out for Danny Woodhead. I think you'll be much happier. Then looking down the list, you got to look at the Arizona Cardinals. Chris Johnson will be a big pickup this week. I want to suggest David Johnson, mainly because I don't like Chris Johnson, the running back. David Johnson, though, there's just no encouraging signs coming from Bruce Arians. He said again on Monday that he wants the rookies to earn their spot, suggesting that David Johnson had not done it yet. Now, he had a big play, a reception, ran down the sideline for a big touchdown in week 1, but it still doesn't look like he's going to get big usage. If you can really afford to, maybe stash him on the bench, but if you need a guy for week 2 to play maybe as a flex, an RB2 in a real pinch, Chris Johnson will at least get starting carries, it looks like. Looking down the list, grab Ronnie Hillman if he's available in your league. He should be available in more than half of leagues. This is a guy that's valuable to have on the bench. Look at what happened with C.J. Anderson last year. Look at what happened with, I'm thinking a couple of years ago, Noshawn Moreno in Denver. There have been a lot of mid-season superstars come out of the Denver Broncos. Why will Ronnie Hillman not be the next one? C.J. Anderson didn't go out and rush for 150 yards. The door is cracked open. And of course, if you're in some terrible league where Bishop Sankey didn't get drafted, jump on it. Looking at wide receivers, obviously James Jones will be the top waiver priority this week. He might be the number 1 overall waiver priority. 2 touchdowns. He had a 3rd called back. He looks like Aaron Rodgers' red zone target. Grab him. He could fill in as a flex, a wide receiver 3 if you needed. He's going to be touchdown reliant, though. He's not going to have any games where he goes 7 catches for 110 yards and no scores. I think he's going to be a red zone monster. And with the Seahawks coming up this week, it's not an ideal matchup. But again, this guy has to be on a roster somewhere. Then looking to the Dallas Cowboys, Terrence Williams. With Des Bryant gone 4 to 6 to 8 to question mark weeks, Terrence Williams steps in as the number 1 receiver. I think he'll be number 2 for targets behind Jason Witten. I think Lance Dunbar is going to get a ton of targets out of the backfield too. That's a guy to consider for a real flyer at running back. But Terrence Williams, there's no reason he will not be getting 8, 9 targets a game, and there's potential there. Then you can look at Stevie Johnson of the Chargers. 6 receptions for 82 yards and a touchdown. Playing alongside Keenan Allen, especially when Antonio Gates comes back. Darius Green looked good. He's going to get some looks, especially in the red zone. Dante Moncrief of the Colts is a guy that you should be targeting if you need someone this week. He went 6 receptions for 46 yards and a touchdown. T.Y. Hilton is not looking to be a sure thing on Monday Night Football. I believe they're playing the New York Jets. So, will Moncrief draw something from Revis? I hope not. But if he's the starting receiver for Andrew Luck, you've got to jump on that. And my last suggestion, although I'm not as high on him as most people, Brandon Coleman of the New Orleans Saints. 4 receptions, 41 yards, and a touchdown. He's playing the Buccaneers this week. If you really need a flex, a wide receiver 3, if you're in a big league and you need a wide receiver 4 or 5, flirt with it. Hope for a touchdown because you'll need the touchdown. But this is a guy that I'd like to stash on my bench and see what happens. Then let's look at the tight end group. If you have not already, someone in your league is going to be adding Austin Seferian-Jenkins. 5 catches, 110 yards, 2 touchdowns. He was, in most leagues, in most formats, the number 1 point getter at tight end. And tight end is a position that for years has been starved of top-end fantasy talent. He could be the number 1 target for a lot of people in your league. Ladarius Green of the Chargers. If you need a guy for the next 3 weeks before Antonio Gates comes back, maybe you grab Ladarius Green now, and a week early, maybe in week 3, you jump and grab Antonio Gates. He grabbed, what did he do this week? 5 catches, 74 yards, and 1 touchdown. Again, these are going off the top of my head. I like to stat load as the week goes on, so correct me if these are off, but I think he was 5 for 71, 74, and 1 touchdown. Ladarius Green, he looked athletic. I watched some of the tape of that game, and instead of him just being a fast guy playing tight end, he finally looked like a tight end that was a fast guy. It's been a long time coming, but he's got the opportunity. And then, another tight end you can target if you miss out on those 2, which you might, Eric Ebron of the Detroit Lions. He caught a touchdown this week. I think he had 4 receptions, just over 50 yards. He was the top tight end talent in last year's draft, good enough to warrant a top 10 pick. Tight ends do not have good rookie years. That's not how it goes. Eric Ebron is as physically talented as nearly any tight end in this league, in terms of raw physical talent. So jump on him. If Calvin Johnson's not producing, Golden Tate isn't the biggest red zone weapon, there's potential there. And then let's get into the streaming defenses. Again, the most important choice you make every week is which defense you stream, in my very biased opinion, and my defensive-loving opinion. A few that I will be targeting. Number 1, if you can still get your paws on them, the Miami Dolphins. Why? They face the Jacksonville Jaguars. They won't be available in many leagues, but if they are in yours, get all over that. The Baltimore Ravens, again, they're probably majority owned right now, but if you're in a league without them owned, they play the Oakland Raiders this week. Will the Raiders have Carr at quarterback, McGloin? It's not looking good in Oakland already. Looking a little further down at teams that won't be highly owned, the Carolina Panthers. They are not projected to have a big week by ESPN or Yahoo. They face the Houston Texans. It doesn't look like Houston will have Foster back yet. So they're facing Alfred Blue. Will it be Ryan Mallett? Will it be Brian Hoyer? I think they'll be okay. I think that the Carolina Panthers could have another big week against the Houston Texans. And the one dark horse defense that I think I might be just crazy enough to try this week is the Tennessee Titans facing the Cleveland Browns, who may be featuring Johnny Manziel. Tennessee looked good in week 1, and if there is one man I trust to mess with a rookie QB or a young QB, for all intents and purposes, Johnny Manziel is still a rookie. Really, this is kind of his first year in the league after a washout 2014. I trust Dick LeBeau, defensive coordinator of those Tennessee Titans. And if Marcus Mariota can control the ball, if the great, the untouchable, the transcendent Bishop Sankey, if he can control the ball on the ground, I think that'll take a lot of pressure off this defense. And Johnny Manziel is always good for a fumble. He's always good for an interception. I don't think that Isaiah Crowell and Duke Johnson are really something to be afraid of. And I feel like an absolute crazy person telling you to pick up the Tennessee Titans on waivers, but I just might be the guy that does it this week. So if you have any other fantasy football questions, the big thing I want to pump out this week is that you can always reach out over Twitter. That's at the Backup Punter all week long. I'm always not too far from my phone. Always got TweetDeck open on the laptop. So tweet in any fantasy questions you do have. Whether it's as simple as, should I start this guy or this guy? Should I make this guy my number one waiver priority or this guy? Tweet me anytime. I'll get back to you as quick as I can. Just give me all the details you can. Is it a 12-team league? Do you have 3 wide receivers rostered, 4 of them? Give me all the info you've got. Ask me any questions, and I'll get back to you. And you can also submit questions for the podcast itself. I'll happily get to any questions on air that you might have, so you can send those in over Twitter or through email, thebackupunter@gmail.com. So this has been episode 24. Again, the first episode of the Backup Punter Podcast in the regular season of the NFL. It feels so good to be back to real football, even if you have to put up with the odd 49ers versus Vikings game. So we'll get back to this next week. Look out for game picks on thebackupunter.com this Thursday. Best of luck in your fantasy matchups. Best of luck finding the kicker and defense that are going to change your week. This is Keegan Matheson, hoping that all of your punts in life stop on the 1-yard line. We'll talk next Tuesday.